Lori and let her educate us. Thank you for doing this for us.
Oh, you're very welcome. And thank you all for having me. Thank you to the Sisterhood for inviting me to speak with you all. It's a pleasure to be here with you all this evening. I'm just going to quickly share my screen really quickly. I have a PowerPoint. There we go. Hopefully everybody can see that. Okay. My presentation's about a good 35 minutes, and then after that, we'll have some Q&A. So again, thank you all for having me here this evening. It's a pleasure to be here. There are a lot of misconceptions about human trafficking. Many think human trafficking is happening in foreign countries to foreign women in brothels or massage parlors. And yes, while that is a part of sex trafficking and human trafficking, a bigger part of human trafficking is that it's happening right here in our own country, right here in our own cities and states, and right here in our own neighborhoods. According to the International Labor Organization, human trafficking is a $150 billion a year business globally and a $32 billion a year business in the United States. Human trafficking continues to be reported in all 50 states and Washington, D.C. Florida, excuse me, ranks number 3 behind California and Texas for having the highest number of reported cases of sex trafficking. And in the state of Florida, the Tampa Bay area is one of the most problematic areas, as well as Orlando, Jacksonville, and Miami. And that is for several reasons, one of which are the waterways. We have 4 professional teams, strip clubs, major highways, and international access. A little bit of a fun fact, there are 19,495 cities in the United States, and the Tampa Bay area consistently ranks in the top 10 for human trafficking activity, of all those cities for human trafficking activity. 71% of trafficking victims are women and up to 25% are children, and that does include boys and girls. There are about 100 to 300,000 sex trafficking victims under the age of 18 in the US per year. 12 to 13 years is the average age of entry for girls in the sexual exploitation industry, and for boys, it's 11 years old. Globally, there are about 4.8 million persons forced into sexual exploitation, and an estimated of 40.3 million children, women, and men are caught in the cycle of human trafficking worldwide. So human trafficking is an umbrella term that includes both labor and sex trafficking. According to the International Labor Organization, labor trafficking is much more prevalent. However, sex trafficking is much more lucrative. So of the $150 billion a year I spoke of earlier, $99 billion of that is related to sex trafficking, making it 66% of the global profits. Human trafficking ranks second behind arms trade and drug trafficking. Think of it like this. You can sell a drug one time, but you can sell an individual over and over and over again. The formal definition of sex trafficking, according to the Trafficking Victims Protection Act of 2000, is an individual over the age of 18 induced into a commercial sex act through the use of force, fraud, or coercion, or an individual under the age of 18 induced into a commercial sex act. If it is a minor, you do not have to prove force, fraud, or coercion. Commercial sex, as it's used in the formal definition, includes prostitution, pornography, and sexual performances done in exchange for something of value. So money, drugs, shelter, food, or clothing. Labor trafficking, as it's defined in the Trafficking Victims Protection Act of 2000, is the recruitment, harboring, transportation, provision, or obtaining of a person for labor or services through the use of force, fraud, or coercion for the purpose of involuntary servitude, debt, bondage, or slavery. There are a variety of locations where one can find human trafficking. So for commercial sex, you can find it in brothels, on the internet, in massage parlors, on the streets, bars, nightclubs, private houses, escort agencies, and motels. Forced labor can be found in sweatshops, agriculture, manufacturing, construction, restaurants, hotels, domestic work, carnivals, health, and beauty services. It's important to mention there is a difference between human trafficking and human smuggling. Human trafficking involves the exploiting of men, women, and children for the purpose of forced labor or commercial sexual exploitation. Whereas human smuggling typically involves some sort of provision. So it's either transportation or fraudulent documents given to an individual who voluntarily seeks to gain illegal entry into a foreign country. Now, it is possible that a crime starts out as human smuggling and then can quickly turn into human trafficking. So this is this is a global representation of what sex trafficking looks like. Sex trafficking is a supply-demand problem with the demand driving the profits. So the countries in the red are the supply countries. So here you're looking at China, Ukraine, and Russia. The countries in the blue are the consumers of sex trafficking. So here you're looking at the United States, Japan, Italy, and Germany, with the United States being the largest consumer of sex trafficking. Again, human trafficking is quickly becoming the second most common criminal act. Sex trafficking is highly profitable. You can sell a drug one time, but you can sell an individual over and over and over again. And these women, boys that are being trafficked are getting raped and sexually abused 10 to 15 times a day. So now it's important to look at who is getting trafficked. And one of the biggest misconceptions about who gets trafficked is that it's our runaways, our drug addicts, and our foster care kids. And while those individuals are most certainly at a much greater risk of being trafficked, sex trafficking doesn't discriminate. So it doesn't matter what your race or gender is. The LGBTQ community is at a much greater risk of being trafficked. It doesn't matter what your socioeconomic level is or your level of education. The one thing that a trafficker is looking for, regardless of all those things, is a naive, vulnerable individual that they can exploit and make a profit off of. And there are many things that make a teen vulnerable. So divorce of parents, bullying, rape, history of sexual and physical abuse, death of a loved one, drug addiction, problems in the home or runaways, foster care, other vulnerabilities that are not included on this slide, poverty, natural disasters, mental health issues, not having access to good quality health care, especially if you have chronic health issues, not having access to quality education. Again, traffickers are looking for individuals with low self-esteem, individuals that are sometimes classified as being like loners. Before we move on, I want to give a brief example of how the death of a loved one can result in human trafficking. So this was a young lady, she 19 or 20, that we rescued during the 2019 Miami Super Bowl. And she lived in Kansas, and she was extremely close with her grandmother, and she had just lost her grandmother. So she was posting on Facebook how sad she was that she lost her grandmother. And a gentleman reached out to her whom she did not know and basically told her all the things that she wanted to hear, needed to hear to make herself feel better. And in that communication, he shared with her that he was a photographer for plus size women, and she was slightly overweight. So he asked her if she would fly down from Kansas to Orlando and be one of his models, and she obliged and said yes. When she got to Orlando, she quickly realized that he was not a photographer for plus size women, and she was being forced to have sex, to be trafficked. From Orlando, he then transported her to Tampa. And that's when we got a call, and she was hiding out in the Hilton Hotel next to West Shore Mall. Fortunately for her, we were able to rescue her. We were able to get her out of that situation and get her back to Kansas safely. And we were actually able to rescue the trafficker, which I have to share with you is very unusual. It's very difficult to arrest traffickers because you have to prove force, fraud, or coercion. And it's very difficult to prove those things because there's a lot of technicalities associated with that. But in this particular instance, we were blessed with evidence to get him arrested, and then we were able to get her back to Kansas safely. But again, just an example, one of many, many examples I could give of, somebody who's vulnerable. She lost somebody she was extremely close with and landed in a very unfortunate situation. So now let's turn our attention to who is trafficking and how they're recruiting individuals into this horrific crime. So there are several ways with which an individual can be recruited into trafficking, one of which is through abduction. And one of the biggest misconceptions about abduction is that these traffickers are snatching our kids from the bus stops and the malls. Now, can this happen? Sure. Does it happen? Yes. But abduction is the least likely way that an individual will be recruited into trafficking. In fact, it's less than 1%. So think of it like this. Anytime somebody is abducted, there's a lot of attention surrounding that abduction, right? You've got law enforcement involved, you've got the community involved, you have Amber Alerts involved. And so that's a lot of unwanted attention geared towards the trafficker. Like, he's really not interested in all that drama per se. The more likely way that an individual is going to be recruited into trafficking is through social media. And social media has become this awesome conduit for traffickers to reel in new victims. And the way that they do this is they pose as either a photographer for, a modeling agency, like the girl I just spoke with in her situation, or they pose as a modeling agency looking for models, or they pose as another teen or young person, and then they reach out to the potential victim. All social media apps are potential platforms for, risks of being trafficked. So the usual suspects are your Snapchat, your Instagram, your TikTok, your Facebook, but also dating apps, the WhatsApp app, truly any app, the Xbox, games that the kids are playing, can happen over that as well. Another way of recruitment is if the victim responded to some sort of ad, and that's typically going to be a work ad. Maybe the victim met an individual who promises them marriage, education, job, or a better life. And this is typically good. The trafficker in this particular instance is typically going to be like a boyfriend type, which I'm actually going to talk about that in a few minutes. The victim may have sought out the help of a smuggler to get into the United States, like I spoke about earlier. And then finally, the victim may have been sold to traffickers by parents or an intimate partner. And that's actually very common too. They typically do that for drugs or money. The parents will traffic their kids for drugs or money. So the recruitment process is very similar to how a pedophile works, right? So there's the grooming, the gaining of the trust, the exploitation of the vulnerabilities and manipulation of the vulnerabilities, and then the exploitation. And it's that recruitment process that's the more likely way that an individual is going to be recruited into trafficking. And that's typically going to happen through social media or through some sort of group chat. And I have to mention that traffickers are extremely patient. So they will groom an individual for a week or 2 years, like however long it takes, if they know to be able to get this individual in. Yes.
Want to make dinner in a sec?
Ronnie, can you mute?
Did somebody have a question?
No,
Okay,
continue on, Laura.
Not sure.
Diet Coke. What? Did we have Diet Coke?
No, but I did earlier.
How was
Ronnie,
your
please
meeting?
mute. Ronnie, please mute. I can't.
So I'm going to continue on.
Yes, please.
So the recruitment process starts where the trafficker first identifies the need of a child. So for a teen, it's the love and affection of an adult. For a runaway, it's their next meal, a bed to sleep in, clothing. For an adult, it's going to be drugs or money. And then the trafficker is going to fulfill that need. And then the trafficker is going to remove any other sources of need fulfillment. So in other words, they're going to start isolating them from family and friends. And then the trafficker is going to exploit that child's dependence for need fulfillment by forcing them into prostitution. And initially, the victim doesn't even realize they're being trafficked because their needs are being fulfilled, right? Or if they have a family history of sexual abuse, then this is sort of the norm for them. And then the traffickers have a variety of tactics to keep them into submission. So for example, they give them drugs, they become addicted, so they want to stay for the drugs. The traffickers take away any money or identification they have at the time that they're initially recruited. The trafficker threatens their family and friends. And then there's this psychological entrapment. Traffickers are master manipulators and they brainwash their victims. So traffickers can either work alone or in a large criminal network. Regardless of how they work, they're all looking to do the same thing, find that naive, vulnerable individual that they can exploit and make a profit off of. I have to mention there is no one single type of person that traffics. So it's a sleazy gang pimp that we all think about with the purple pants and the gold chain and the big hat, but it can be the multimillionaire, it can be the teacher, the parent, religious leaders, parents, and boyfriends. The two pictures on my slide here are actual traffickers that were arrested. So you can see traffickers could be a female, traffickers can be a male. There are 4 general types of traffickers. The first of which is the Romeo pimp, and he's typically like the boyfriend or the intimate partner. He's one of the more common types of pimps, and he generally works in 4 stages. And the first stage is the initial contact stage. So this is where he meets his, potential victim online at the mall, tells them all the things they want to hear, how beautiful they are, takes them to get their nails done, buys them expensive handbags and clothing, shopping sprees, all the things. The second stage is the control stage, and this is where he starts to isolate the victim from family and friends. The third stage is the separation stage, and this is where the victim now leaves their family and friends. And then the fourth stage is the trauma bonding stage, and this is the alternating of love and affection with the trafficker, and this is when Stockholm syndrome ensues. Again, it's that traumatic bonding between the trafficker and the victim. The second type of trafficker is the gorilla pimp. He is the worst. They're all bad, but the gorilla pimp is typically the most violent. So gorilla pimps, drugs are typically involved. Brutal rape and violence is oftentimes involved. A lot of physical abuse with gorilla pimps. Gang pimps are on the rise. Drugs are oftentimes involved. Gangs use the victims sexually and violently for gang initiation. And sadly, oftentimes the victims are very loyal to the gang. So it's really hard to get them out of there. And then familial trafficking, again, this is parents or somebody in the family that's trafficking the child or the individual. Usually there's a family history of sexual abuse, and then over time turns into trafficking. So the 2 most common types of trafficker, the Romeo pimp, which is like the boyfriend or the intimate partner, that makes up about 28% of all traffickers. And the second most common type of trafficker is familial trafficking. So that's like the parents or somebody in the household, and that makes up about 33% of all traffickers. So why don't they just run away? I actually get this question asked a lot. It's a really great question. And here's the deal. This is why human trafficking awareness and education is so incredibly important. So in many instances, victims are being trafficked in isolation. So they're in apartments, motels, or private residences. In many other instances, these victims are being trafficked in plain sight. They're walking around talking on their cell phone, interacting with individuals in the community. Many victims are living at home while being trafficked. Many victims are actually going to school while being trafficked. But because of the lack of education and awareness on human trafficking, they are oftentimes misidentified by the people that they come in contact with. So for example, if you see a young woman or a young girl, particularly if they are a US citizen, engaging in prostitution or commercial sex, they are oftentimes thought of as making the choice every single day to be there and doing that. But the reality of their situation is this. Many of these individuals were recruited into trafficking when they were teenagers, and they were never able to get out, and this is all they know. Many of these individuals are being forced into prostitution by a trafficker through the use of force, fraud, or coercion, where the trafficker is taking all of the profits. Many of these women are addicted to drugs given to them by the traffickers, so they don't want to leave. Many of them have no money or identification because all of that was taken away from them when they were initially recruited. Many of them have Stockholm syndrome. Many of them feel a tremendous amount of guilt and shame, and oftentimes feel like it's their fault that they are in that situation. Many of them have their families being threatened, so they don't want to leave. And then there's that psychological entrapment that I spoke about earlier. Traffickers are master manipulators, and they brainwash their victims. So in their mind, they feel like there's no way out of their situation. They feel hopeless unless they become unprofitable because of trauma, emotional breakdown, or advanced pregnancy, if they're helped by a client, or by death. The average lifespan of a trafficked victim is 7 years. So remember earlier when I told you that the average age of a girl getting into trafficking is 12 to 13, and for a boy it's 11, and the average age is 7 years. So what I try to tell individuals in the community is that we need to withhold judgment for these individuals and instead offer compassion and resources. So who are the buyers? Buyers are also known as Johns. And there's a lot of misconceptions about who's buying sex. Many think it's like the creepy pervert who sits at home and watches porn. And I'm sure that guy is out there buying sex. But the truth of the matter is, buyers come in all professions. Doctors, lawyers, law enforcement, firefighters, teachers, coaches. Buyers can truly be anybody. 54% of buyers are Caucasian, 40 years and older, married with kids. The buyer funds the human trafficking industry by purchasing sex for goods and services. Demographic traits are poor predictors for as to who is buying sex. So race and sexual orientation have no profiling power. Buyers span the income distribution with one exception. High frequency buyers typically have an annual income of $100,000 or more, and high frequency buyers will typically spend about $100 per transaction. Buyers also visit a range of venues to purchase sex. So brothels, adult establishments, they go to the streets, they buy online. There's really no one single venue where men are purchasing sex, with the exception of the high frequency buyers. They are typically visiting the brothels. So as community leaders, members, teachers, parents, what are we looking for in somebody who's being trafficked, in a traffic victim? So to start, any signs of physical abuse: bruises, burns, contusions, scars, signs of fractures. Signs of fractures include deformities, swellings around deformities, bruisings around deformities, and fractures are typically going to happen in the face because they get punched in the face a lot, or in the upper extremity, oftentimes from fighting back or just being physically abused in their upper extremities. They're oftentimes less appropriately dressed than usual, or inappropriately dressed for the weather. So if it's 45 degrees and they're walking around in short shorts and a crop top, obviously putting that into context with other things, that's a little bit of a red flag. There may be signs of malnutrition, dehydration, exhaustion. So starvation is oftentimes a consequence to some sort of, quote, bad behavior. What do I mean by bad behavior? These women, these girls are oftentimes forced to meet a quota, like a financial quota, every night. So if they don't meet their quota, if they're fighting with the trafficker, if they're trying to escape, there's oftentimes consequences to that. Consequences range from rape, physical abuse, and then starvation. So again, when you're looking for red flags, look for signs of malnutrition, dehydration, exhaustion. Tattoos is another indicator of somebody who's being sex trafficked. I'm actually going to go into tattoos in a couple slides down the road in a little bit more detail. There's going to be some unexplained behavior. So, maybe they're missing a lot of school, so they have frequent absences from school. They may have, more sexualized behavior. If you're a teacher, you may notice that they're overly tired in class. Oftentimes, victims are being trafficked in the middle of the night, so they're not getting a lot of sleep. They may come across as being withdrawn, anxious, depressed, or fearful. They may fail to make eye contact with you, so maybe they're looking at the ground, they're sitting slumped over. They may stay out later than usual, missing curfews. They may be accompanied by somebody who is controlling, and if it's a male, it's typically going to be somebody who's older. You may notice that they're starting to spend time with suspicious people. They may start withdrawing from activities that they really, really enjoy. So if they're really big into gymnastics or baseball or, the piano, and then, suddenly you're noticing they have no interest in those things anymore. You may notice a drop in their grades. They may show signs of gang affiliation. And so what I mean by that is you'll either see strange symbols as a tattoo, or maybe they're doodling on their notebook or on a piece of paper, like strange symbols. They may be inconsistent when they're recounting events. And this is oftentimes due to the drugs and to the trauma, because trauma disrupts the timeline. You may notice a change in their friends, or that they're starting to date older men. You may start picking up on some unexplained possessions. So for example, prepaid cell phones, hotel key cards, false identification. They may display expensive clothes or brag about having a lot of money. And that's, especially a red flag if they don't have a job and they don't come from a family with means. They may have unexplained possessions. So that all of a sudden you notice they're walking around with diamond bracelets on, really nice watches, diamond earrings, designer handbags. And again, they can't afford it. Their family can't afford it. And then you may notice, and this is specifically going to be in an airport, that the girls are traveling with belongings in a plastic bag. Because again, these victims really don't have anything except for the clothes on their back and maybe a change of clothes. So they're not going to have suitcases and duffel bags and all those kind of things. So again, as I mentioned before, tattoos are another indicator of somebody who's being sex trafficked. It's also referred to as branding. Traffickers like to call it tagging their M&M or their moneymaker. And tattoos are a sign of ownership. They are oftentimes in plain sight, but sometimes they're also hidden. So common places under clothing, you'll find them on the buttocks, the lower back, the lower abdomen, or along the thigh. Tattoos that you oftentimes see in trafficked victims, but obviously I'm going to put the disclaimer. If you see somebody with a crown tattoo, that doesn't necessarily mean they're being trafficked. But these are common tattoos in individuals that are being trafficked. So diamonds, bows, crowns, dollar signs, money bags, barcodes, tattoos that read property of, and they'll oftentimes have the trafficker's name underneath it. Tattoos that read daddy's girl, tattoos that read loyalty. There may be a tattoo of like a strange symbol. Again, that can be indicative of somebody who's part of a gang. We rescued a young lady in the Miami Super Bowl, actually, who had a dollar sign on her ring finger. And that oftentimes, when it's on the ring finger, that oftentimes means she's in love with her trafficker, and her trafficker is more than likely a Romeo pimp. So what we all really want to know is, how do we protect our kids from this awful crime, right? Because as I mentioned before, there's no one single profile as to who gets trafficked. Every child, every individual can be an unfortunate victim to this crime. So as parents, and grandparents, what can we do to protect our children? First and foremost, I cannot emphasize this enough, is to maintain open communication with your child, and maintain open communication about all the things. So human trafficking, what human trafficking is and the dangers of human trafficking, social media and the dangers of social media, drugs and alcohol, sex, pregnancy, safe dating, consent, rape. All those things are really important. And having those conversations for years, like along the years, like starting in elementary school, having these conversations multiple times through high school, obviously tailoring the conversation to the child's age and maturity level. But the conversation you have with them at 12 is going to be very different than the conversation you have with them at 17. I believe in transparency. I am not one to sugarcoat things with my own children. I feel like knowledge is power, and the more they know, the better. Obviously, there's a very fine balance between giving your kids information to keep them safe and to help them make good choices, and then, of course, not making them anxious and freaked out about every little thing, because we don't want, our kids are anxious enough with all the things that are going on in this world. So obviously we're not trying to like up that ante, but so that's a fine line. I understand that, but it's really important to have these conversations, because knowledge is power. And the whole purpose of that is, if your child gets in trouble, you want them to come to you when they have a problem. You don't want them going to their friend who doesn't know anything about anything, and you don't want them looking on the internet. So communication, first and foremost, is one of the best things you can do. Get to know your friends, the friends of your children. Obviously, follow your children and their friends on social media. It's very eye-opening. You learn a lot about their friends on social media, not necessarily bad things, but it's just good to kind of, learn something about them. Read the comments under their posts. They're very entertaining and they tell you a lot. Be aware of surroundings. So, I tell young people, when you're walking out to your car, stay off your phone. Be aware of where you're parked, who's parked around you, those kind of safety things. Teach your child resiliency. And this is really, really important. So teaching them how to successfully adapt and handle a crisis situation in healthy ways. And I want to give you an example of a young lady that we took care of who kind of really struggled with this part. So she actually lives in Texas. She was a high school girl who was extremely close with her family and very involved in her church. And she went to prom when she was a junior in high school, and she was raped. And to put it into her words, you know, she said she felt like she got something back. She lost something that she feels like she'll never get back. And she really struggled with the trauma of it. And so instead of going to her parents, she actually turned to drugs to deal with the pain of the trauma and the rape. And she was getting the drugs from a boy in her class who happened to be, we call them like the recruiter. He's like the middleman between the trafficker and the victim. And his role is to basically groom the victim and then eventually introduce them to the trafficker. And so this high school boy was getting paid $40,000 to give this young girl drugs and groom her. And he eventually introduced her to the trafficker. And then she was trafficked for 2 to 3 years. She eventually escaped and was able to get out. She went through rehabilitation. She's doing much, much better. She actually travels around the US and gives talks to high school students on social media safety, on human trafficking. But again, it's just another example of how teaching your kids to be resilient in a time of crisis is really, really important. And fortunately for her, she was able to get out. And because again, many times these young girls aren't able to get out, and that is their life. So back to protecting your child, help your child build a strong self-esteem from an early age. And then finally, teach your child to trust their instincts. You know, I always say your gut is your second brain. Your gut will never steer you wrong. So I tell my kids, if something feels off, it probably is off. If something doesn't feel right, it probably isn't right. So learn to trust your instincts. So what do we do? So if we think somebody is being trafficked, like how do we handle that? First and foremost, please do not attempt to intervene between a trafficker and a victim. It's very dangerous. Traffickers are very, very dangerous. They will oftentimes have weapons. They're not afraid to kill people. They're not afraid to hurt people, obviously. So call 911. But we do have a national trafficking hotline. You can see it here on the screen. I highly recommend that you take a picture of this with your phone, put this in your contact list. You never know when you might need to call. You could be at a restaurant and find a young lady in a bathroom who tells you she's being trafficked and needs your help. But you can also text the word help to 233-733, and that text gets you directly connected with the National Trafficking Hotline. So that's it for my presentation tonight. This is my contact information. If anybody has any questions, please feel free to call me, text me, email me, you know, about anything human trafficking related. I know oftentimes after I give a human trafficking talk, many individuals are inspired to want to get involved in the fight against human trafficking. So I just want to give you a little bit of information about my organization, and in case you are interested in getting involved, and then other organizations in the community. So I am with, as they said early on during my introduction, I'm involved with Alpha House. I'm on the board of directors of Alpha House, and I've started a mentorship program. We take in homeless women from the ages of 14 to 41 who are pregnant, who are victims of either human trafficking or the foster care system. And we provide them with all the things. So housing, rehabilitation, food, clothing, therapy. They have a caseworker. We have classes for them on money, how to budget. They're required to save money. They're required to get a job. They're required to finish high school or at least get their GED. We put them in parenting classes. We put them in classes on, you know, dangers of social media and how to stay safe. So basically all the things they would need to know to be functioning, independent, healthy adults. We put them in therapy to help them get over their trauma. We also, of course, take care of their babies as well. So we provide babies with all their services. The program's been around since 1979. It's done wonderful things for our community. It's helped save a lot of women and their babies. So if anybody is at all interested in our mentorship program, which, as was mentioned early, before I started my talk, I started this program recently. There is a tremendous amount of data out there that supports mentorship programs with marginalized communities, specifically with at-risk youth. It's really a game changer. It changes their life in terms of not getting involved in drugs and alcohol. You know, the graduation rates are much higher of kids who are involved with the mentor. Their likelihood to go to college is much higher when they're involved with the mentor, like all the things. So it's really a wonderful program. So if that's something you might be interested in, you know, let me know. We also have other volunteer opportunities within Alpha House. There are other anti-human trafficking organizations in our community, and each of them serve sort of a different purpose. So we have Stop the Movement, which a good friend of mine started and is involved in. It's a wonderful program. They really focus on the dangers of social media and human trafficking. They do a lot of outreach work in the community. We've got Created, Save a Freedom, and others. So if anybody is interested in getting involved in the fight against human trafficking, you can certainly reach out to me and let me know what you think you would be interested in, and I can try to steer you in the right direction. So thank you again. It was a pleasure speaking with all of you, and I am open for questions.
Lori, would you share that screen with the hotline and the health again?
Yes.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
233733 or be free. Okay. I have a question. Can you explain for those who are not familiar with the term what Stockholm Syndrome is?
Yeah, so Stockholm Syndrome is this traumatic, so we call it like traumatic bonding between a trafficker and a victim. So essentially what is happening is the victim is in love with her trafficker, even though he's beating her, raping her, selling her 10 to 15 times a day for sex, for money. But she still loves him, and she struggles to turn him into law enforcement, even though she knows what he's doing is wrong. So sometimes when we have victims that, like, for example, in the healthcare system, if we have a patient who we think is being trafficked, she will want to get out of the situation. So she'll want to get into an anti-human trafficking organization to get rehabilitated, but she won't want to report the crime. She will not want to get law enforcement involved. And again, oftentimes these girls love these traffickers, despite the trauma and the abuse that they are going through with this trafficker. And they don't want to, they don't want to get away. Oftentimes, when women are rescued and put in a safe house, they oftentimes leave. So it takes 8 touches for a victim to truly get serious about help. So they'll come into our program 3 months, 4 months, 5 months, 1 year, and then they'll leave and go right back to the trafficker. And again, it's that traumatic bond. There's a lot of trauma. It rewires the brain. And so your brain actually emotionally stops developing at the age that the trauma started with you. So if you were being trafficked at the age of 6, that's sort of where things stop for you. So you can imagine when we're, rescuing somebody at the age of like 16 and they've been trafficked for those many years, there's a lot of trauma there. There's a lot of disruption in the brain. So it's really, I hope that made a lot of sense. I hope that helped explain.
Where does the term come from? There is a reason it's called the Stockholm Syndrome.
It is, but you know what? I honestly don't remember. I think I learned it a very long time ago, but I don't remember that.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Any other questions? This is an opportunity to ask Lori any question you want.
Lori, would you like to stop screen share? And
Oh, sure.
I can stop spotlighting you, and then you can see everybody.
Oh, yeah, sure. Thank you for that. Perfect. Yeah, much better.
Barbara. We can't hear you. You're muted.
1 second is what I said. I just wonder if you would share, or if you felt like sharing, how you got into this. I would love to hear how you got into this.
It's really not that exciting of a story, but I will certainly share.
You can do this.
So I don't know how many of you attended my talk back in January of my sort of career change. I became this elite runner and competed.
Oh, yes. Oh, yes.
And so at that time, I was asked to be a featured athlete for a local 5K, and they were raising money for human trafficking. And at that time, I did not know really anything about human trafficking. I don't even really think I saw, signs or billboards for human trafficking. But I looked into it to kind of see what it was all about, and it was definitely something that interests me. I mean, I've kind of recently, in going back with my history, I've kind of recently realized that my interest in this kind of work actually really started back in high school and college. I just didn't really know what I was getting myself involved in, but the interest for me started a very long time ago. And so anyway, fast forward back to, how I got involved. So I did a deep dive into human trafficking, and I was like, oh, wow, this is really interesting. But at that time, I couldn't really get involved in it because I was traveling quite a bit for running and competing all over. And then finally, I think it was 2016, I just literally looked at my husband. I remember the day very vividly in our family room. He was sitting in a chair next to our French doors out to the pool. And I just looked at him and said, I'm going to get involved in the fight against human trafficking. I don't know what that looks like. I don't know what that means, but I've always said I'm just too busy to do it. But there's never going to be a great time. We've got 2 kids, they keep us busy. I'm just going to jump in. And and he said to me, he's like, well, funny that you say that, because I have a patient that I'm going to see in the office tomorrow, and he's on the board of directors at the U.S. Institute Against Human Trafficking. I can see if he would be interested in talking to you and if he can, get you involved somehow. And the rest is history. I met up with Brian, and then eventually became a public speaker for the U.S. Institute. And then through the U.S. Institute, you do networking, you make connections. I got hooked up with Rahabs through the U.S. Institute, and then one thing leads to another. And, I've kind of done everything. I'm still a public speaker. I've been doing that for almost 7 years now, but I've done rescues, I've done rehabilitation. The networking, I've kind of done all the things in the space at this point. But yeah, it all started with running.
Nancy?
And Nancy, unmute.
Okay, I can answer the question about the Stockholm syndrome. In the late 1950s or early 60s, it took place in the city of Stockholm, where a person was kidnapped. She was eventually rescued, I believe the story goes, and she didn't want to turn her abductor in because she kind of fell in love with him. I don't know if you remember the case with Patty Hearst being abducted by the Black Panthers, and she kind of suffered the same situation.
Right, yeah. Okay. Could you tell us more about Rahab's daughters and what it is and what it does?
Yeah, I'm no longer with them. So just so you guys know. Yeah, so actually Gila, who's on the call, she actually was, I was the director and Gila was my assistant director. So we worked very closely together with that organization, and together we did a tremendous amount of great work. I'm very proud of what her and I did in the community with Rahab's. Gila was an amazing assistant for me. But we did all the thing, the organization was founded by Sam, who was actually a victim of trafficking herself. She was trafficked from the age of 16 to 21. And she actually suffered some pretty horrific abuse through that experience, and eventually, wanted to start her own nonprofit. And so she did. She lived in Chicago. I believe she lives in Canada now, but she started the organization in Chicago, and then made it a point, because she was trafficked at 4 consecutive Super Bowls. She made it a point to set up a chapter in every city where there was a Super Bowl. And that's sort of how her organization grew. And then each city sort of had their own, kind of limitations. And so some had safe houses, some didn't. But basically, we did everything with Rahab's. We did education. Gila and I got out to the community a lot and did talks on human trafficking. We also helped to try to get a safe house going in the community, which didn't end up happening, but we put a tremendous amount of work into trying to get a safe house going here. We did rescues. We partnered with other organizations so we could do rescues and those kind of things. We did a little bit of rehabilitation. but yeah, we eventually, and then we put on the huge like Super Bowl event when it was here in Tampa back in 2020, I think it was, or 2021. I can't remember when it was in Tampa. So we did a tremendous amount of work, and I'm very proud of what her and I did for the Super Bowl here. We partnered with, gosh, 200 organizations and churches outside of Florida and within Florida, and people came from all over, and we did outreach. Which that was the other thing that Gil and I would do. We spearheaded outreach on the weekends into strip clubs and on the streets and in massage parlors where we knew human trafficking was happening to try and help the women. So it really was like this very like comprehensive organization where we got to see a lot and do quite a bit of stuff. So yeah.
I have a question. Do you need to be a professional social worker, a qualified social worker, to volunteer as a mentor, or
No, you don't. You don't need for a volunteer. You don't have to. You don't have to be a social worker or have any sort of qualifications. You just have to be passionate about the cause and want to help the women. For the mentorship programs, we put you through, at least through Alpha House, and I would say through most organizations as well. But I'll speak on Alpha House because that's the organization I'm involved in. We put you through a
I'm
tremendous.
about to grill a burger, but I have more upstairs if you want.
But whoever's talking, please mute.
It's after 7,
Oh, sorry.
but that was lovely to ask.
Yeah. But no, we put you through a tremendous amount of training. And then DCF requires, so the state requires a bunch of training as well because there are minors, on property. So again, you don't need to be anything special, no special degree or anything like that. You just need to be passionate about the cause, and then we put you through the training.
right?
How long does the training take?
So it's kind of dependent up to you. There's 10 hours that are required through DCF. And you do that on your own on the computer. So we send you the link, and then each session is either 30 minutes, 45 minutes, or an hour. So it just depends on the session that you're doing. And the sessions range from human trafficking to, maternity things, foster care, trauma-informed care, just like all the things you would need. And that's in total 10 hours. But again, that's self-paid. So it could take you a month. It could take you 3 days, depending upon how ambitious you are with doing it. And then you have to go. I actually have a training that I give to the volunteers, which is like a good hour. And then, the staff at Alpha House put you through a little bit of an orientation. So I don't know, maybe 10 to 15 hours in total between the training, going to Alpha House, getting the orientation there, and yeah.
Any other questions? What are the things that you do to mentor these people? Is it teaching them reading? What is it that you Lonnie, go ahead.
That's a really great question. So honestly, you can do whatever you want to do with your mentors. You can take them for coffee, you can read with them, you can do a craft with them. The whole point of the mentorship program is sort of a couple things. Number one, it's to expose them to experiences that they never would otherwise be exposed to. And for many of these in marginalized communities and at-risk communities, it's something very, very simple. So it's like taking them to a coffee shop. Many of them have never been to a coffee shop. Your role is not to save them. It's not to be there to like, oh my gosh, they've had this horrific trauma and all these bad things happen, and I'm going to be the one to pull them through and make them successful in their life. Honestly, what they're really looking for is somebody that they can rely on and they can trust. They've never had anybody in their life that they can trust and rely on. So it's very, it's a process to develop a relationship with them. It takes time. So consistency is really important. So if you say you're going to be there, you need to be there. And then what you do with them again is, and then being with them without judgment. That's really important too. Because you have to go into these relationships with the mentees with an open heart and an open mind. You have to remember that a lot of the choices they have made has been based on survival. Nobody wants to be raped 15 times a day. Many women who stay in it, if they've had babies, their babies will be trafficked as well. So they make choices to protect their children.
That's how
Okay.
today's been for me.
So, so you go in without judgment, you listen, you have empathy and compassion, and then you're just there for them. And again, expose them to experiences maybe they would not have otherwise, had. And then find out what their interests are. Like, maybe you play the piano. So you say to them, you know what, have you ever played the piano? Like, I brought my keyboard with me. Let me show you a few things on that. Or like one of the mentors at Alpha House that we just brought in, she plays the guitar and she's like, I bought a ukulele for the mentee and I'm going to teach her how to play the guitar. And so you can introduce them to all these like wonderful, arts and experiences that they would otherwise never be exposed to. Yeah.
So it's really whatever the person you're working with, how you strike up that relationship and
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely.
Ronnie asked a question, how can we best educate our children?
Well, like in terms of actual resources, like a book or
I don't know. Ronnie, would you ask your question, please?
Yes,
Ronnie?
I will. Yes, I'm
Okay.
here. I had to unmute myself. So, but thank you for your patience. I wrote another note right after that, and that is our kids are so influenced by influencers or entertainers such as Taylor Swift, and they don't really listen to what or learn the way we traditionally learned or were taught. So how can we best reach them in today's real world where there's so much violence, there's so much war, there's so much negativity, and this is just another one of those subjects? How can we reach them on this particular subject with someone like a Taylor Swift or I don't know what else, because I don't think these kids learn traditionally anymore.
Yeah, I mean, that's a really great question. It is hard. I mean, I just know with my own kids, and I'm sure, those of you have, we probably are all in the same boat, right? Like you teach your kids about drugs and they think, or I don't know, drinking and like all the things. It can even be something super simple as like, put your shoes on when you go outside so you don't step on something and hurt your foot. And they think you're crazy. They think you're nagging. They don't. And, it's a great question. How do you get around that? I think the way that I have tried to navigate that with my own kids is I'm very consistent with my messaging. I show my kids videos. I mean, I can tell you when my kids were 12, I literally brought up YouTube and I showed them, this is what meth can do to you if you take meth. They were 12. And I mean, my daughter and I were just talking about that the other day. We talked about teen pregnancy when they were 12. And my daughter still remembers those conversations. So they may not, what I would say is having those conversations over time, which is why in the talk I said, maintaining open communication, don't just talk to them about one and be like a one and done. You have to talk to them when they're 12. They're probably going to look at you like you're crazy and like, what are you talking about? That doesn't apply to me. That's never going to happen to me. Like we've all heard that. But then you readdress at the age of, 14, you readdress at the age of 15. I showed my kids videos. I was extremely transparent with my kids. I was very open. I don't sugarcoat things with my children because I just felt like that was doing a disservice to not be truthful with them. That's kind of what worked for me. I know that's not going to work for everybody. To answer your question more bluntly, I don't really have a great answer for that. I don't know what it is. I feel like every child learns differently. Every child gets the messaging differently. I parent my two kids differently. But I do the best that I can with being open and honest. And like I said, I used videos on YouTube. I tried to tailor conversations If I knew of somebody like a celebrity or somebody that knew something or was doing something important in that work, then I would tell my kids that, like, hey, remember how we talked about this? Well, guess what such and such is doing now? They're like spearheading this, concert on this thing. And, sometimes it got their attention, sometimes it didn't. But I can tell you now that my kids are, almost 20 and almost 21. Now they get it. And I'm happy about that. And my kids always came to me when they had a problem. So I just go back to just being honest and communicating and the best that we can, going online, showing them videos, doing the research. But it's really hard. I mean, I hear you. I don't know. Gila, do you have a great answer for that? I don't with what you've done.
I actually don't. I think you covered it. I think you're 100% right that every kid learns differently, and it's just what resonates with them and figuring out how to get them that information.
I wish there was an easy way around that.
No, there isn't.
Mm.
Being a parent is really, it's really a difficult task, and I don't care how many guidebooks and journals you read.
Yep.
It's a tough task, and you think you're doing right. And how many times we've seen kids who have grown up in what we think is a very stable home, and they've gone off on a deep end, and you have no answers.
Yeah. Yeah, it's very true.
Just one more comment question. Our local football team, the Bucks, are owned by a Jewish family.
Mm-hmm.
And football players, also sports athletes, are very influential. Is there anything that we could think of to include them? Because kids listen to people like that, and we might have access to that, and it would be more, it would be listened to because it's a football player. I mean, it's like,
yeah, no, that's a great point. Tim Tebow, the former football player, he's really, really big into the fight against human trafficking. He actually has his own organization. So he's definitely somebody in terms of athletes who has his hand in it for sure. I'm not really familiar with any other athletes who but that's a really great point. I know there's a lot of not a lot, but there's a few celebrities that have some human trafficking organizations, some anti-human trafficking organizations that are involved in the fight as well. So yeah, I mean, if you can find the celebrities who are doing the work and the athletes that are doing the work, it's certainly a really great way to connect with your kids and hopefully get the message to resonate with them for sure.
Again, thank you so much.
Oh, you're very welcome. Thank you all for inviting me.
Okay. The mentorship program, by the way, Ronnie, is not for our kids. The mentorship program she was talking about is where we go and help the people who have been trafficked and rescued.
Yeah. No, I know that.
Okay,
but
all right. I just, when I read your thing, I wasn't sure that because I know you came in late, so.
Yeah, I know. I was thinking in a broader sense because this is a huge problem. It's just like bullying doesn't just happen to some people. It can happen to a football player too. And so this is like such a touchy subject. It's no pun intended, but it's awful. And I know that Nadav Weitzman worked on a bar mitzvah project on this very subject. That's only one of our many kids in the Jewish community. And I just think that would be nice if we could reach out, but in a novel way. That's all.
Yeah.
Good point. Good point. Does anybody else have any questions for Lori or for Gila? Okay. Well, I want to thank you. This was excellent. I learned a great deal. And I mean, some of the statistics that you presented were just they're mind-boggling.
Yeah, I think what most people don't realize is how prevalent it is here in Florida, and specifically our area. I mean, there's still, as much as I've talked, all the years that I've given human trafficking talks and tried to educate, it's people still have this misconception about where it's actually happening, but it's I can tell you, for as many stories that I have about the foster kids and the runaways, I have just as many stories about kids who came from really good families that were being trafficked here in our community. So it's everywhere. It's happening in front of you, and you just probably just don't see it. But I have a feeling after this talk, you're probably going to be a little bit more aware of things. I know that certainly rang true for me when, after I was asked to be the featured athlete for that 5K, I felt like I never saw anything about human trafficking. And then all of a sudden I saw
And
all
you
the
saw
things.
it everywhere. You saw it.
Yeah. So yeah.
And I love you, the 2 points that struck out to me, and I'm going to repeat them, was the one that you said where little boys are trafficked from age 11.
Mm.
Oh, and that their lifespan is only about 6 or 7 years after they've been trafficked.
Yeah. So boys, so to the point about the boys, about 50% of children that are being trafficked are boys. The data says about 30%, but we know with boys it's underreported. So we're guessing it's probably closer to 50%. A lot of trafficking with boys is what we call survival sex. So there's a lot of shame and guilt with boys and sexual abuse and sex trafficking, which is why a lot of times it doesn't get reported. So they're living on the streets, having sex for money, having sex for food, having sex for clothes. So yeah, it's a real problem with boys too. And again, another misconception is that it's just happening with girls and women. But we know that's not the case. The U.S. Institute actually had a safe house just for boys for quite some time, actually, up in Tampa. So yes, and then the average lifespan of 7 years, and that's just because of the abuse and the awful toll that the constant physical, sexual, and mental abuse takes on their body as a whole. So it's, remembering that this doesn't just go on for like a couple days. This is going on for weeks, for many of them months, and for many of them years. So they actually end up with pretty significant medical problems as a result of their trafficked experience, whether it's from the sexual abuse and all the rape, the physical abuse, and then they have a lot of mental health issues. So PTSD is the most common mental health issue in sex trafficked victims. Sex trafficked victims have a much greater risk of PTSD and suicidal ideations. So
yeah, because how else are you going to get out of this?
Yeah, I know. It's really.
And then the other point was, don't try to go between the trafficker and the victim.
Yes, don't do that.
Call the hotline.
Call the hotline. I mean, I can tell you from my personal experience during the Super Bowls, I've been chased by a trafficker before. When I worked in the Miami Super Bowl, we went to Orlando to do the Pro Bowl. And, when the girls are out on the streets and we were trying to help them, the pimps were there watching, and they tried to run us off the road. They chased us down the road. They don't mess around. It's their money makers. So they don't take that.
How did the girls react when you approached them? How did you approach them?
So to answer your first question, how did they respond? So if they were on the street, they knew the trafficker was there, they would oftentimes run from us or tell us not to approach them, because they knew if they talked to us that there would be consequences to that. So they would probably be physically abused and things like that. Some girls will, there's that. Now, when you're in the strip clubs and you're in the brothels, it's a very different kind of situation with how the girls respond and what you're saying to them, because you're not out in the open like you are on the streets. In terms of how the girls responded to us, if we were on the streets, some of them, when we approach them, we don't say, hey, we think you're being trafficked, come with us. We just ask them, do you need help? Is everything okay? We tell them who we are. We're very, honest. We're Rahab's daughters, or we're, you know, whatever organization we're coming from, we're honest about it, because there's a lot of little offshoot organizations associated with churches that do outreach and like strip clubs and things like that. So the organizations, they kind of, you know, say who they are and give them a gift. Usually it's like a rose with their information on it. Like it'll have like a little tag with their information on it. It could be baked goods. It could be a rock with a like inspirational quote on it, but there's always the organization's information on it. So you give it to the girl. How are you doing? Would you like us to pray with you tonight? If you need help or you need anything, let us know. When we go into the brothels, we oftentimes have like makeup bags. And in the makeup bags, we would put like our card in it with our information. And we would just walk up to the woman at the desk and say, we're from, you know, whatever, Rahab's Daughters. We have some gifts for the girls. You know, can you give this to them? And, you know, so we're honest. Strip clubs, it's the same thing. They think we're the church ladies coming with gifts. I mean, the bouncers and the guys that work the doors. So yeah, we're just pretty open and transparent about it, honestly. And the girls, most of the time, they're very receptive. They take the gifts and, okay, sounds good. And then sometimes they call you later. Sometimes they don't. But we just kind of feel like if we at least help one girl, then that's a win, because it's,
Right.
you know, it's hard
Right.
to get them out of the life.
It is. It must be very, I can't even comprehend it.
Yeah, it is pretty unimaginable sometimes. Yeah, when you hear what they've been through, for sure.
Does anybody else have any questions? Thank you so very much.
Thank you all for joining me tonight. I appreciate you.
We appreciate you. Thank you for bringing this subject to us. We think this was very, very important to hear.
Thank you. Have a great night.
You too.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. We're gonna, unless there's something else, we're gonna end the meeting. No? Bye.
Bye.
Night.
Night.
Good night.
Good night.
Thank you again, Lori.
Thanks again.